Now I'm going to touch lightly on some other issues. We've heard that this is a very dangerous bridge and needs to be replaced. In fact, their own map shows that there were actually relatively few accidents on the bridge itself. Most of the accidents are related to congestion and they're related to the on-ramps, and we think could be dealt with very directly. As it turns out, the crash rate on this bridge is not any higher than on the other bridges in the region. It's in fact less than the crash rate on the Fremont Bridge, according to ODOT's state highway crash rate tables from last year. Moreover, the interstate freeway and the I-5 bridge portion of the system is not, by any stretch of the imagination, the least safe part of the system. You can see that the non-freeway state highways, arterials and minor arterials, have more than double the accident rate on an accidents per mile basis, as does the I-5 bridge. So this is not a huge safety issue. Similarly, freight, I think, is not really a serious issue here for a variety of reasons. And I won't touch on any of these, I'll just hit some specifics. First of all, you should know that freight already essentially avoids routes around peak travel. That's what logistics managers do. They arrange for very cost-minimizing behavior, and by their estimates, 85 to 90% of truck travel either occurs during off-peak hours or in the non-peak direction in peak hours. And that tells you that people who move stuff by truck have a lot of flexibility. And in fact, truck movements are lowest at the evening rush hour. So we know that there's a lot of flexibility there. We also know that freight movement in the United States is declining relative to GDP in response to gas prices. And this is another one of those kind of system-changing events that you have to pay attention to. The red line is gas prices, which have gone up. The blue line is freight movement in the U.S. economy per unit of GDP. And you can see as long as gas prices were stable, we continued to move about the same amount of freight. But starting in 2004, when gas prices went up, freight movements, particularly truck movements, went down. Now, almost all of their freight information is from the 2002 Commodity Flow Survey. All of their projections assumed freight movements based on very cheap gasoline and diesel. And we're seeing a sea change in the way the freight system works. And part of it has to do with the movement of freight to rail. We already know that according to an independent study, 100,000 trucks are going between Puget Sound and Portland on rail, essentially move containers onto rail and so on. That would be a very viable alternative for dealing with this and obviously has energy benefits. In fact, nationally, we know that intermodal is growing up rapidly. Even though the trucking industry is declining, intermodal rail container on flat car has grown 16% in just the last 2 years. Again, a real trend-breaking phenomenon that we have to be aware of. We also know that nearly all of the freight, despite the hand-waving about the global economy, is really local. 2/3 of all the freight in this region moves less than 50 miles, so it has a lot of flexibility, and very little of it actually is high value. 2/3 of it is gravel, stone, wood, metal, coke, and oil products. This is not stuff that is really just-in-time deliveries of critical products, and that's from the federal 2002 Commodity Flow Survey. We know that all of the high-value industries that are growing in this region are not, by any stretch of the imagination, freight-dependent industries. The apparel industry, sporting goods and apparel, the machinery industry, the electronics industry, essentially move trivial amounts of stuff. What they need access to is people. So freight movement has very little to do with their economic health. In fact, and I apologize, this is a little scatter diagram, but it basically shows you there is no correlation whatsoever between congestion at the metropolitan level and the growth of the wholesale industry in metropolitan areas. In fact, if there is any correlation between congestion and growth, its highly congested areas tend to have healthier economies than places with low congestion. So if you think you're going to drive the Portland economy by spending $4 billion on this bridge, you're probably mistaken. In fact, Ed Glazer at Harvard, who's the dean of the nation's urban economists, basically says we can now ignore freight movement when we comes to explaining how urban economies work. That is essentially a 19th century view of economies. Seismic safety has come up. Again, I think this is a bit of a red herring. The CRC's own estimates show that you could bring this up to the 2,500-year no-collapse standard for between $100 and $200 million. And if you are worried about seismic issues in this corridor and about freight movement, one ought to draw one's attention about 3/4 of a mile downstream to that twin railroad bridge, which in effect is the only freight connection between Oregon and Washington. It is older than the older of the two interstate bridges. And if we lose that bridge, there is essentially no replacement. Whereas in the case of the highway bridge, we've already built the I-205 bridge. It meets much higher earthquake standards than either of the railroad bridge or the older highway bridge. So the seismic issue in freight is clearly not the case. I've been working with colleagues who are concerned about this project. We've identified a 6-step pay-as-you-go alternative that meters our response to this problem to our available resources and focuses very tightly on the specific problems. We think you can toll the existing bridge to raise money to fix it, to improve transit, to upgrade the bridge, that you can fix the existing railroad bridge and deal with the river traffic issues as a result, modify the ramps on Hayden Island to deal with some of those safety issues and congestion issues, and then once you've put those things in place, look at a separate bridge for light rail to Clark County. Finally, I want to conclude by talking about process. It's a bit frustrating to engage in a detailed conversation of this project without an EIS in hand. It was originally scheduled to be released at the end of February, early March. I would submit for any public agency, including the Planning Commission, you cannot have a serious discussion of the implications of this without having EIS in hand. And given what the size of it is going to be, knowing the size of this project, having given a lot of independent experts an opportunity to take a very close and careful look at it. So the due diligence here for the size of this project and the momentousness of this decision requires that everything be out in the open. Second, I want to emphasize this, that all of the forecasts, all of the numbers that they've given you are only as good as the models and the assumptions that they've been built on. And they need to tell us, and we need to be comfortable that the kind of assumptions they've made about future gas prices and future carbon policies, whether it's cap and trade or carbon tax, make sense to us, that they've dealt with induced land use demand. And as far as we can tell, they've made the same land use assumptions whether you build this project or not, which flies in the face of the way we know that investments influence land use planning. I apologize for the spelling on the last one. We really need a sensitivity analysis. Given the fact that there are lots of different ways the world could turn out, they need to tell us if we have $3 or $5 or $2 gas, what can we expect? And we need to be able to vary the assumptions so that you can use your assumptions rather than have them make the assumptions for you. As I mentioned earlier, I think you should insist on seeing what was called the investment grade forecast so that you know how this influences the financing of other things in the region. And then finally, I just have to say, it's, I think, really critical that we get some background documents for public inspection. I've been waiting for 5 weeks on a public information request that I made to the CRC for just some really basic information about the modeling that they've been presenting the results of for some time, and I'm still waiting for that. I'm also waiting for some other specific things that I've asked for. But again, it's really difficult as a member of the public to make comments on this unless we have the actual information. And I think that's one of the things that you all should be insisting on as a part of the process for this determination. I appreciate your patience in listening to this lengthy testimony. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Joe. Jay, any further comments from your group? I think what we want to do is kind of move to, as Gil stated earlier, getting all of our questions out.